Over to you, mate. I know we've been following each other for a while. I first learned of you when you were doing some work at Gorgeous, and then you've since sort of branched out on your own. Why don't you just give us a quick rundown, minute or two, of like your career progression and what you're doing now?
Yeah, so I'm basically just a data nerd. I've been in the data space now for about 6 years, and specifically when I say data, I mean in terms of B2B information, B2B contacts and company information. So I started my career. I started at Microsoft, out of college. Was a PM at OneNote. Really loved working on that product and getting to see what the enterprise world kind of looked like. And then realized that I needed to kind of switch 180 degrees and went to just do music for a couple of years. And when I ran out of money, I went back into tech, and the first thing I dove into was data. And so I got a job at Discover.org, which is now ZoomInfo. Um, and sort of watched that progression. I was one of the first data engineers there, first data scientist at the company, and sort of helped sort of shape both of those teams. And then from there, I went to another data company called People Data Labs, worked there for a short stint. Went to Gorgeous after that, and then helped a couple other data companies like Charm.io, another data company, and now started ExactBuyer.
Nice, I love it. Short and sweet. And I think there's a lot of talk about startups and harvesting data, and data is the new oil. So it's very interesting, and there's this whole controversy around Facebook's data usage. So it is kind of like the thing that's less spoken about in Silicon Valley and in the tech world. A lot of people don't understand it. So just to give us a quick idea of like, what do you mean exactly by this kind of data that we're talking about?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and to be fair, data can be this kind of shadowy empire industry, and we can get into a little bit of some of those examples. I won't mention any names, but but yeah, I think the privacy implications are very serious. So the type of data that I work on, it's the two entities that we care about specifically are people and companies. Those are two entities that I focus on, and the relationship basically between those two entities. Right, that's the entire focus of the work that I focus on. Now, when you talk about people, obviously there's sensitive stuff. With companies, it's slightly less so, unless you're talking about financial details or private related information. But when you're talking about people, there's lots of types of information you can glean. Some people have access to your bank accounts and transaction records, right? You need a specific type of, a license basically to go and fetch that type of information or store that type of information about people. Um, uh, if you're doing any types of like credit reporting and you want to get certain types of fields information related to other people's financial health, you have to have again certain licenses there. So we don't deal with any of that. The specific data that I care about when it comes to people is what are they saying publicly about themselves, right? What are they posting about on Twitter? What are they writing in their sort of biography there? How do they describe themselves, and what do they show the rest of the world, right? So we're never like breaking terms of service and like going in and trying to find data that you don't really want to share with other people, which is like totally fair. We more care about synthesizing the data that we do know about you and how you want to present yourself, and making it easier for other people to find you if they want to find you, right? Or if you're trying to get a job, whether you're trying to be sold something, or whether in a B2B context or a B2C context.
I suppose like this is where I come in, because if I'm like, okay, let's just put this in context. We're going to a company, we want to grow the company, and probably the biggest use case in B2B is in sales, so prospecting. So there's a lot of programs, like you just mentioned one, Zoom Info that you used to work for, heavily used by sales prospecting teams. So is Apollo.io. There's heaps of them now, right? You've got your own now, which is great. And basically, what they're doing is just getting email address, first name, last name, company, title. People scrape LinkedIn all the time and get this kind of data, and then you're layering over other data sets that maybe enrich they turn that sort of basic data set into something a bit more interesting, and then we use that as a growth lever. So, question to you: how do you use this information for business growth? Is
Yeah, so I think the problem that Exact Buyer, you probably hear it in the name. The thing that we're trying to solve is just to improve your targeting, right? And so that's the sort of fundamental thing that we're trying to figure out. And there's many roads that will lead you to improve targeting, but the ones that we're trying to figure out is how can we take all the keyword data that we know about people and try to match that to what you're looking for and create a better search paradigm today, right? So the paradigms today, if you're doing B2B search, just like kind of like you go to Google and you're just like, I don't know. Maybe you search for like show me someone who like knows Python in San Francisco, but like you'll get some content pieces or blogs, right? You're not going to get details about those people. Or you go to LinkedIn, maybe you type that in, or you use Sales Navigator or Zoom Info or one of those tools, right? A list building tool, and you'll try to build lists. But what you've seen is like that's really sloppy, and like a lot of people don't know like what industry do I choose, like what is Figma, is it a design company, is it a internet company, is it a computer software company, like how do I choose the right industry? So list building is this super like archaic thing that people do because like you can get very advanced, and if you're good at it, the super data nerds like ourselves are like super into it, like how many different permutations or variations of things can I play around and mess with. But for most people, it's just like I just need to find this person who is in San Francisco and like knows Python and Java or something and speaks French or something. I don't know.
This is where I see some of this fall over is like the quality of the list. It's like anyone can create a list, a bad list, right, of data, like a prospect list. I could buy it off somebody. There's brokers that lend you a list, but like, what's the quality of that list? How well has it been filtered? How accurate is the data that I'm purchasing? And if I'm buying it for 10 cents, 20 cents a lead, probably arguably low. But then it's all that sort of that filtering process. I find that turns maybe a low quality list into something that's really, really valuable, that I can, you know, uh, work more of my time on rather than some of the lower prospects. So what sort of factors play into quality of this data?
So I think it's exactly like you're saying. Like how specific can you get? That's the thing that I kind of focus on. How specific can you get about your ideal buyer, right? And so like prospecting, like on the one extreme, it's like if you're trying to find like a mate for life, like a partner that you're going to be with. It's like you're not going to be like, well, like are they in New York and are they between this and this age, and that's good enough for me. Like I'm just going to use those two filters and like make a list. Or do you want to know a lot more? Like do they have the same interests as me, or do they have whatever in a B2B context and an actual sales context, you might say like, hey, I see that the head of growth is the exact person that is going to use a tool like mine because I'm selling an API for growth, and the head of growth is charged with like growing at scale, right? Growing super fast, using this data, making sure that it's highly accurate because it's all about improving CAC, improving efficiency. Like that's going to be my target, maybe even more so than a VP of sales, which is also charged with revenue goals and doing all of that. But maybe it's more account based, right? And maybe it's less, data driven, right? Um, and so those are the types of things where we're trying to help people identify. For example, what we do is we look in your CRM, right, and we analyze everyone in your CRM, and then we say like, okay, based on who was in your CRM, we think like you're selling better to this company or to this certain persona than others, right? And because we have more filters than just the highest five, like revenue, industry, the usual suspects, because we have maybe hundreds or even thousands of different features or attributes to calculate on. Now you're getting incredibly granular, right? And now you can spend more of your marketing dollars targeting those people first, right? And then maybe going to the sort of secondary and tertiary, segments that you might want to sell.
Yeah, because there's this classic sort of argument like, hey, micro targeting versus mass media targeting. Obviously, everyone in the ad industry goes, no, don't micro target. That's bad because they make, a percentage, the business model is a percentage of aggregate revenue, right? Spend. So they're very much in that
Right,
camp.
right.
There is some
CPMs.
validity to that argument in terms of like mass, brand salience or awareness of the brand can lead to sales. But it's a very, at the initial stage of a small organization or a medium sized organization, you just don't have the luxury of paying all that money to generate that. So you are
Right,
forced to think about targeting, and segmenting your market into smaller, more I would say buyers that are within your ICP or ideal customer profile, or that match your offering really well.
right.
You're right, it does come down to some of those more granular parameters when we're making this hard decision about where do we start, and then let's broaden out from there, like a land and expand segmentation approach. So yeah, do you see, just coming back to the quality thing, what about recency as well? Because I've noticed some people saying these lists, like especially during COVID, people have switched businesses so many times. Like, are they even at that company anymore?
Yeah, exactly. So that's one of the biggest things with, with a lot of companies, is making sure that the data is updated in real time. So when we talk about real time data, it means like you want to understand when you're looking at a company or a person where they are at that moment in time, not again like you said 7 months ago where they used to work, or when the last time it was updated. Now the issue with a lot of data companies, right, and this is like the thing that most data companies face is how do we update the entire database? Like how do we update whatever 400 million contacts? Like every week, every day, like all the time, every day, or how do we subscribe to these changes? And so the thing is, what we've sort of come up with is, well, we're not going to have our database is never going to be fully up to date, and no one else's database, because that's impossible. So what we're going to do is we're going to let you build a list based on the information that we currently have, and then just when you're exporting it, right before you plug it into your campaign, we're going to uh, we're going to basically fetch real-time data on all of those people. So we're going to fetch the most up-to-date job information about them, make sure they still work at the company that they say they're working at, verify that their email actually works. If they have a new email at a new company, verify that that actually works. And so we do this sort of all of that verification process. And I feel like that's, if anyone who's doing B2B lead gen at scale, every large agency, they all care about this, right? Because it's all about efficiency. It's all about scale and efficiency, and doing it, doing it often and doing it well. So for them, it's really important. I think recency, um, as people have more and more online digital identities, like that becomes even more important, because it's like, what are they posting about? Maybe that can be an action or a signal to say, hey, this person's really interested in, maybe getting VC funding now, if you're a VC or whatever it is.
It's like, are they in market or are they out in market? I think is the thing we want to know. And like some of those signals, if they're not recent, they can be out or in. You don't know. So I like how you're doing this, so the enrichment validation at the end of the process, which makes sense to me, because I was like, the processing power to update all this stuff every day would be insane. So I get it. We talked about one use case here, we're alluding to in B2B sales, which is like enrichment of profiles when you're doing a prospect. So everybody uses, generally a CRM, you would say, at some degree. And a lot of CRMs then have an add-on where you can enrich that contact. So maybe you start with a name and email, or just a name, and then you can use these third-party tools sometimes joined in with the CRM to then give a lot more clarity to who that person is, what they do, all that kind of thing. So, what are the main ways that works practically for companies that you've seen?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different teams that rely on that CRM data, right? It's, you have sales team, marketing team, customer success teams, support teams. So typically it depends. Everyone, when you enrich that data, typically what you're enriching is to get the things we were talking about earlier, which is making sure, does that person still work at the company? Has that person changed jobs? Where they're a director of sales and now they're the CRO. So you can understand sort of where they are. So on the customer success side, right, you want to enrich that information so you can make sure that, like, if your champion now leaves that company, you want to know, hey, I really need to go talk to someone else at that company to make sure that we don't lose this account. Or I need to, and I, by the way, I also want to follow this person to whatever company they go next to make sure that they also use our service as well, right? So that's really useful for on the customer success side. For sales and marketing, it's more of just identifying. It's kind of like you said, are they in market? Has anything changed for them recently? And then obviously just making sure that their contact information is accurate, right? Their phone number, their direct dials, their email addresses, making sure that you have correct information on that is important for whatever marketing campaigns or sales campaigns you're going to run.
And just getting to tools here, I know this is getting a bit tactical, but like I know I've integrated like Clearbit into Salesforce and HubSpot before. Sometimes the CRMs have their own sort of version of that are just reselling those services. So let's just say we've got a prospect list in our CRM, but we don't know about this world of data enrichment. What's the ways to go about doing that?
So just like you mentioned, there are tools. There are several tools that exist that have done data enrichment. They've existed for a long time. Probably the most well known ones are Clearbit and ZoomInfo. I would say now there are several others that do variations or have specific specialties. But um, and is the question is the question from you, how does it actually work practically? Or
Well, a lot of the time they don't come out of the box, do they? Like you get a CRM and it's just like, okay, you start with a list, upload your list of prospects, and then it's just like nothing else. And a lot of people, I think, in smaller sales teams, maybe less experienced, aren't aware that they can take this to the next level, and then that will help them prioritize their time as a sales and marketing team in the right direction rather than methodically just go top down to bottom of the list, right? Yeah, let's just say you don't have enrichment, you don't know about it, and then someone tells you, like on this podcast, and then you want to do it. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so typically how that used to work was, you have your data in an Excel spreadsheet or something, and then you would go to ZoomInfo or Clearbit, you'd upload your CSV, your spreadsheet, and then they'd basically fill out all the information, append all the new information, tell you if it's verified or not, and then you would use that, plug that into whatever back into your CRM or whatever. Now they have these marketplaces. So the two probably most common CRMs are Salesforce and HubSpot. And both of them have marketplaces where, just like you mentioned, you can have applications in those marketplaces that your sales ops team or rev ops team or marketing ops team can use to integrate into. And then that will basically just keep the data fresh on whatever cadence you choose. So let's say you say, I want this specific subset or segment updated all the time because they're our customers, and maybe I want this other segment updated, on some other cadence. And that's typically how it works, and it just plugs directly into the CRM, and does it whenever you want.
Let's get into the dark side then a bit, if you want to go there. Like, we know there's these shadowy markets where people buy and sell data. You always hear of these hacks that happen to these companies, and then the whole database is on the dark web, and they're ransoming it or selling it for free or with money. So tell me a bit about the stories you've heard, and what's the bad stuff that goes on here.
Yeah, I mean, all of that happens. That's without a doubt, right? Um, there's a lot of very interesting things that go on with data. I mean, obviously, a lot of those leaks are username password leaks or some combination of those where they're leaking kind of that kind of sensitive information. There's lots of ways to source data, and I would say there's a lot of companies that trade data. There's a lot of these like data unions that people operate. Sometimes they're legal, sometimes they're not. And that's just kind of the truth of it. Some of them is just like, hey, I'm gonna trade you all these IP addresses tied to emails. Sometimes they're passing MAIDs, which are mobile device IDs tied to other IP addresses, and so basically it's just one huge identity resolution job where all of these data companies are sharing data and trying to figure out who has what data to fill in the gaps that they don't have. Right. That's sort of the data industry in a nutshell. A lot of different players are using each other's data. Um, but in terms of the shadowy data that you're mentioning, like those like huge Facebook leaks and all those, there are some people that use that data. There's very few people that I know that are public about using that data, or even have it even show it in their applications because of privacy implications. But you can get public data from all those different sources. It's it's a bit shadowy though. It is. I mean, I think even in your world, maybe I would imagine that there's a lot of companies whose underlying data sets have come from some shadowy places.
I had I can't say who, very successful company now, multi-billion dollar publicly listed company. I met them when they first started, and they fell upon the customer database of a company they used to work for. And they were started up a new sort of rival company, and oh wow, they started with a whole list of that other company's customers, and then because they had that, they could approach them all directly, and because they were customers of that one, they were selling a very similar service. It was just easy to then onboard and grow. But the story they sold was, oh no, we're just really good at what we do, and here's our financial backers, and it's our brand and it's our product and blah blah blah. But no, the real story was a customer database from their rival was acquired and used for the start phase of their growth, for example. So that happens all the time.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, that without a doubt happens all the time. I think people are we're still in the wild west of figuring out how to even harness customer data and like secure it in any sensible way. I mean, I also worked at yeah.
So what's legal though? Like different countries, we've got GDPR, we've got the CCPA, is it in California or something? Different legislation. What's legal, what's not legal? Does it depend on your jurisdiction, or
It does depend on your jurisdiction. I think things are sort of converging towards some of the laws that the GDPR and CCPA implemented. So with GDPR, there's basically a rule around legitimate interest, right? So you can use someone's legitimate business interest. So you can use someone's work email to reach out to them in a cold fashion if you think that they have a reason to buy your product, which is a pretty generic thing. And that's basically like I think the only reason why that law got passed, because there was this giant fucking loophole in it. That was just like, yeah, like we're going to protect everyone's privacy unless we want to sell them something. And then I think CCPA is trying to do the same. But one thing that, the U.S. laws are a lot more lax about is sort of like someone's direct personal email, whereas in Europe they're very much not that. You cannot reach out to people's personal emails for any reason, work related or otherwise, as far as I understand, unless they've opted in. That's right, unless they've opted in, right? So if they come to you and sign up for a mailing list, then certainly you can reach them.
So you can't do a lot of this. If I came to you as a data broker and went, "Hey, can I have a prospect list for this country in Europe that I want to market to?" I would be not really able to use that for. I mean, I could probably upload it to my sales CRM and then make a direct approach, but I wouldn't be able to use that data to make the direct approach.
You would be able to. It depends on where you're contacting them, right? So it depends on if you're calling them or emailing their work email or emailing their personal email. I think there's different rules for each, and I haven't dug into it, but I know that you can reach out to them. I mean, you can for instance use, if you source the data in a compliant way, and there's like double opt-ins, you can use that data and, let's say, upload it to Facebook and then target those people on Facebook, right? Um, you can do that if the data is opted in at some point.
So we've talked about using data and acquiring it for sales, direct sales approaches or outbound, right? So we're maybe cold emailing them, or we're using the phone number to call them, or get through the gatekeeper, etc. Or we're finding out their social media accounts, and then we can sort of DM them on there if they connect with us. Same in like LinkedIn, a lot of sales teams do that. But what about if we want to use it to warm them up with targeted paid advertising? So a lot of there's a couple of big ABM platforms out there that I know do this, where you can set your targeting parameters and then all your spend is very, very targeted and there's not much wastage. So instead of relying on, example, I go into LinkedIn and I go, I want to target all CEOs. Sometimes that targeting parameter is a bit out, especially on Facebook, the same kind of thing. Like everyone can just call themselves a CEO, but they're not really a CEO. So, when you're starting with this more granular data, you can upload that into some of these programs and then create what's called an audience targeting profile inside that ad platform so that you're only targeting those people. Do you see a lot of that usage for this data as well as another use case?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's one major use case for it, and I think there's different players in that. There's like LiveRamp, which sort of onboards everyone's data and then sort of builds audiences through that. There's the metadata and the Sixth Sense and Demand Base and those ABM platforms. That Terminus, I think, is another one of those, specifically digital advertising. So there's several of those. I think it's super useful to, when I was thinking, especially in a B2B context, when you don't have millions of buyers, you might have like 50 to 60,000 true buyers of your, like, forever. That's your entire market. And so maybe that's what, that I want to spend all my marketing dollars on those 50,000 people. And I don't care if I've shown them impressions 300 times, like I just keep hitting them until they buy from me. I feel like that's a valid strategy for a lot of companies. I did that myself as the head of growth at a data company. We used our own data to just strictly target those specific people who we knew are going to be our buyers. And it's very successful. I think even in completely unnuanced way that I did it, it was very successful. So I'm sure if you're using something like metadata, which is A/B testing and testing audiences and creative and messaging, that's going to be way more successful.
So much better than just doing it manually, log into each of these programs and like LinkedIn and then Facebook and then Twitter and doing separate campaigns. Like just do it all out of the one box. It makes sense to me, and you draw it from the same audience, right? So a lot of the better companies, they use that sort of centralized customer targeting database to then put into the audience targeting of each of those platforms. So that's really great. How do people get this wrong? Like, what are the big failure points? Let's just say I'm a bit less experienced in this realm. Perhaps think back to younger days, and that maybe some of the missteps you could easily make if you're not aware of this. Where do you see data usage in this context fail?
Yeah, I think we touched on some of it before, which is just like recency and accuracy of the audiences you're building, right? And especially if you're thinking about building it in the context of, like, digital advertising, you really don't want to fuck it up, because every time you mess up one field, you choose the wrong industries, or you choose, you multiply those effects together, and you very quickly end up with an audience that may be like 20 to 30% as effective as it could be, just because it's inaccurate. So I think that, as unsexy as it is like truly the highest leverage activity, is just making sure that you get accurate data, that's actually like classified correctly. And I think most people sort of skip over that step, because either people tell them like, just trust us, this data is right, and they're like, okay, and they sort of move on and they focus on everything else. But I think if people really just spend time there and are like, are you really sure, like, can we sit here and talk about why this data is accurate, and like, can we spot check 100 records, right, and just to make sure that they're actually accurate, right? It's not going to take you all day. You can just spend an hour and just spot check them and say, is this recent, is it relevant, is this really who we want to be targeting? I think that's the place where founders make the biggest mistake, because what they'll do is they'll end up throwing it into these email sending platforms. They'll just like put in like 5,000 contacts into this campaign, and they just let it ride, right? Just like, within the next 2 months we're totally going to get like 700 demos, it's going to be great. And then they realize, like, halfway in, that's like, well, now our mailboxes don't work anymore, because like none of those people work at those companies. We got a ton of like bounce backs, like everyone's mad at us because they're just like, they're pissed at Jim who left the company, and so now they're marking you as spam. So it's, you can get, the more you focus really on just like doing it, focusing on the accuracy part, I think really makes everything down funnel from that way more successful.
Everyone says, even sales and prospecting, like, spend a disproportionate amount of time on the first part, which is making sure your prospect list is like high quality and valid, and then everything else, you'll save yourself so much time. So speaking about that cold email, I am going to cover this in a separate episode about cold email outreach, actually just after this one. So but before we do that, like, where do you see the biggest missteps there? Because you mentioned IP blacklisting. I know that happens a lot. I just had this happen to a couple of people that are companies that I was talking to, and they were using their own corporate email Gmail address, the salespeople, to then do cold outreach. And obviously, after a couple of times, they're like, "Who the hell are these people?" Mark, mark, mark. And then I had to go to the domain blacklist and checking that, and they didn't have a process for that. So IT weren't monitoring that. So then they were like wondering why all their customer service, calls and sales, subsequent sales, account management wasn't going to the people, and they weren't aware of these things, and there's a whole communication breakdown. So that was one example. Is that the biggest problem you see happening, or?
I think there's other inefficiencies, which is just like, kind of like we mentioned, like just throwing a bunch of people onto a list and just like letting it ride, even if it doesn't work. It's just like, how do you it's you have to wait maybe 2-3 months for you to get through that entire list, right? So if you're not prioritizing those people, like, now hopefully you get sales, but you won't know, for another 3 months, what the total outcome of that will be. um, I think those are the issues. But in terms of cold email, not warming up domains enough, I think is definitely one, or like being overzealous, with new campaigns. I think that's definitely one. There's advanced things that you can do, like using multiple different domains. So you can use exactbuyer.org, exactbuyer.net, exactbuyer.io, and then round robin even within a single campaign to use those. You can even take it a step further and do some, we're experimenting with this right now, but we're actually using GPT-3 to automate sending and personalizing emails. So you can do that based on the data that we have, right, about someone. I know someone's a VP of sales. I look at their about me, right, and I could take that information on LinkedIn and then also look at their skills and what languages they speak and where they live. And if I was SDR needing to craft this message, I'd have to really think about all those things and then tie that into the first sentence or two of what I'm sending. Now you have machines that can do it just as well, if not better, and at scale. And so it just makes sense to sort of use those types of things to do that. The other benefit of doing that is now, you're not it doesn't look as similar every time you send an email, right? So it's not like the algorithm that Google's using is not saying like, hey, like we recognize that all they're changing our company name and first name in this email, but everything is exactly the same.
Oh, the copies, the cut and paste kind of like format thing that gets detected really easily, whereas hyper personalized, every single email different, doesn't trip the anti spam barriers as much.
Right, and you can even set the different models now to, you can set the weights to basically be, more and more different, right? Or you can make it more creative every single email, which can make it seem more of what a natural human in theory would do. Um, but in reality, humans are someone who's an SDR who has to send 120 emails a day is probably not being hyper personalized either.
I mean, I get all those like terrible DMs on LinkedIn as well, like the just the standard sort of sales approach thing. Like, hey, great, thanks for connecting, and then they just go into this 300-word diatribe of like selling to you, and you're like, I just literally clicked accept. Like, who are you? And I think some people forget there's an incentive for like output. So like, hey, I sent 100 emails today. I'm like, yeah, but how many of those responded? Did you piss 50 of those 100 off? Because you just had something that was meaningless. So I think there's a bit of understanding there between output and the outcome. So what is a good if you're doing using this data right for let's just say marketing, so some of the advertising to support some of this manual outreach. Then you do manual outreach. Like, what is a good sort of response rate on some of this? Let's just say we've got a really good quality list um, that we source from maybe someone such as yourself, and we put that and we're using that data. Like, what can you expect as a response return?
So I think when it comes to cold emails, specifically talking about emails, there's a couple major metrics that we look at. You're looking at bounce rates. So first, deliverability, how many actually get into the domain. You really want to have super high deliverability. It should be like 97% or higher. If it's lower than that, either you're having some troubles with your domain, and maybe you should take a look at some internal tooling. But you should really get high rates of deliverability. In terms of the validity of the email addresses, there's oftentimes you're going to get from different vendors like probable email addresses, which means basically that data vendor like guessed at an email and just said like, yeah, we think this is it. Go for it. You try and let us know. And so that there are certain data vendors that take that approach and they sell data for super cheap. But then you're going to see 15 to 20% bounce rates or higher, and then very quickly your campaign's going to fizzle out, right? So what I think something that we see when we use our own data, we dog food our own data, we're seeing like 2.5% bounce rates or lower. I think you want to be below 3% is typically a benchmark that I hear, if you can, but it's harder to get below 3% than I think a lot of people think. But I think anywhere below that, you're in a pretty solid range. When it comes to reply rates, I mean, I think that really depends on like how target yeah, the copy of the offer, but I think still mostly how targeted you are, right? It's like you can send someone a pretty shitty message, but if they're really looking for your API and there's like only one other on the market, like they'll probably take the call. um
So it depends how competitively saturated it is and like how in market they are. Yeah, I think there's a and then it's sort of
for
like
sure.
secondarily there's like the offer. You can have a shitty offer, but if there's heaps of demand, it's going to work. But otherwise, crafting, the reason why they want to buy your product and like sort of make it relevant to them. I think that saves a huge chunk of.
Yeah, and I have to admit, I've always been terrible at the copy and the message and the imagery and everything. I've only been good at the data part, so that's kind of why I stuck to that, and I let other people help me with the other parts.
What about when we're searching for a company to supply us data? Like, how do we make a good decision there, depending on what we're going to use it for?
Yeah, I think it's getting harder than ever, to be honest, to sort of run these tests, and we obviously we run them all the time as part of our evaluation phase with customers. I think the best thing is just like try to get some data from each of them, even if you need to pay like a couple $100, whatever it is. Like the investment ultimately that you're going to make in your sales and marketing, the amount that you're going to spend on a couple $100 test is like totally insignificant. So I always tell people like spend the time up front to like really do a legitimate test. You can always run them through known sort of email bouncers. There's tools that allow you to basically upload lists where you can see how many of those emails are actually valid, meaning they'll be deliverable, go to the mail server through the mail server. You can ask them about verification. You can have people just actually make the phone calls, right, for phone numbers and see on a list of 100, what's the accuracy. I think that's the most important part. There's no kind of like shirking that part. I think a lot of people just skip that step and are just like, I don't want to do all that work. Like we're just going to go with the incumbent because like no one's going to get fired for going with the incumbent. So I think that's what you'll typically find.
And they work the volume. I see they just work the volume like, oh, well, if we buy enough of it, we do enough of it, it's going to sort of work itself out. And I think it's a weak argument, but I mean, there's some validity in that. But, great if you're a big brand with a huge budget, big team, not so good if you're a small team. So, yeah, like,
Yeah, and I think I've seen lots of companies succeed with the volume game. I'm not to knock the volume game. I think that's also super important. But I think ultimately, you're going to burn through all of your leads, and hopefully, hopefully you don't do that with too much of a bad taste in people's mouth. Um, so I think you need to be kind of a little nuanced when you do that.
you've obviously been in this profession for how many years have you been doing this?
Since about 2017, so about 5 years actually.
5 years, so five, 7. That's 35 Silicon Valley years, arguably. So,
Yeah, yeah,
a long
exactly,
time. You're almost
exactly.
retired, right? You must have seen a lot of changes back in the day. The cowboy, I would say, even more cowboy data days before Cambridge Analytica, before all that, and then where we are now. So, can you explain to me what it was like before, where we are now, and then perhaps where it's heading?
Yeah, so I mean, if you want to go all the way back, I mean, there's been, there was the yellow pages and the white pages, when we were growing up, and we were using those, and those were the first data vendors ever, right? And you could say, Equifax and those other list building companies. Dun and Bradstreet, certainly some of those older companies, but they sort of come in waves. There's the Dun and Bradstreets, the Equifaxes. And then in the 2000s, there's some other companies started to come around, like the Discover Orgs and the Zoom Infos of the world. And typically, what happens is those got consolidated, right? And then you sort of saw the Wrap Leafs and the Clearbits and Full Contact and all these other API services start to come around. Um, but yeah, I think the interesting in the Wild West. I mean, even when I joined Discover Org, it was very interesting to me because they had 300 people basically calling you up and saying, "Hey, John, is this still your phone number?" Yes, like mark it in the database, like this is still John's phone number, and that's how they verified all the information, right? They would actually like email and call people, and that's how they would manually verify. Not a scalable process at all. At the time, I think they had like 4 million contacts in their database because they could only like they had hundreds and hundreds of people in the office around me, doing this manual task. So that kind of blew my mind when I first joined, because I was just like, hey, there has to be a better way. It's 2017. I know like deep learning is a thing, and like there's lots of very sophisticated way, even unsophisticated ways of doing this better. And I think that's interesting to see how we've sort of progressed even in 5 years from a place where we had people at a company that's making over $100 million a year in revenue, having people manually update a database, to now a system where a small company like ours can do all of that with a handful of engineers. So I think the tools have been the way to understand and classify companies and get data at scale has never been easier than it has today. It's pretty awesome.
Where do you think it's heading? Are we going to have like barcodes tattooed onto our backs and Minority Report style, sort of like I retina sort of scanning information and follow around with personalized ads?
What would the barcode on your back lead me to? What would I be buying if I scanned the
I don't
barcode on your
know.
back?
I'm just bringing some Hollywood sort of theatrics here, but you know what I mean.
um, what's the future of this? I mean, I think the future is extracting more meaning out of people's profiles and improving the search process. I genuinely believe that that's ultimately what people are trying to get. People are always trying to get better results, more accurate results, and I think that doesn't happen in the paradigm that exists now with list building. Right? No one's going to spend 2 hours sort of putting in all these different features. So I think as we build out the knowledge graph of understanding, like all the relationships that you have, right? I know that you've worked at certain companies and you probably know the people who worked at those companies at the times that you were there, right? And so I can start to build those relationships, and there's recommendations that people have provided you on this podcast or elsewhere, right? But if I know that all of your digital identities are tied, and I when analyze the text behind all your digital identities, and I analyzed this podcast and I created a transcription using AI, and I took all the transcripted notes, then I could be like, hey, John really talks about these things all the time, and now I can add that to his profile and sell him those things that he talked about on his podcast.
Shit, someone's already done it to me. Oh crap! They're gonna have all this personal champagne data and everything about me. Oh
That's
no!
right. You're going to get ads for champagne even more than you do now.
Quickly, because I forgot to talk about this, but I know in the back end, a lot of these companies because I worked in Silicon Valley, sometimes the product that they have, let's just say they have a sort of a classified site or it's a buy and sell sort of like matching service, right? A lot of the time, underneath, they're mining all this data, augmenting it with other data that they're harvesting and sort of compiling it and then repackaging that and selling it to like investment companies or hedge funds, or they're selling it to other industry organizations to then use for some other purposes. There's this whole sort of like wholesale sales en masse of these big customer lists. I know it was kind of like in Silicon Valley, like, oh, how big is your database? Oh, my database is this big. And it's like, oh, mine's bigger. It's like this very tit for tat kind of like thing about how much data everyone has. Is that still relevant? Does that still happen? Or is that a bit old school now?
No, it's a really good question, and I do remember those times too, where people are talking about like petabytes of data. Like, how many flops and like Google flops of data do you have? Um, I think I think it depends. I mean, obviously, like as a data person, like you can't just like throw garbage in there and be like, I have a petabyte of just like complete garbage. Like it's wonderful. Um, I think if it's relevant data, it certainly can be made more useful now than ever before. I don't think it's old school. I think honestly, people are sort of trying to make something old look new. I mean, if you think about Equifax, right, and Experian and all these companies, right, it's like they're selling data about you to companies, right? They're helping businesses get credit scores, right? And they're analyzing those businesses and trying to say, should a bank give them a loan, right? So they sell that data to banks to help them analyze how much they should underwrite, and different data providers will sell data to different industries, right? There's certain data providers that only sell to insurance industries to help them to understand how to underwrite business insurance for very specific places. If you're, for instance, I'll give you an example. If you're doing construction, right, and you might get business insurance that says, like, if you say, hey, I do plumbing and I only work on ranches, like I'm never doing roofs, right? I'm never on a roof, so like I don't need that level of insurance, right? But then on your like Instagram is like a picture of you like on a roof, like drinking a beer, right? So like now that company might want that Instagram data of your business to be like, is there any pictures of anyone on a roof, right? And that can tell them information that they would then sell to these insurance companies and say, hey, maybe you should be careful about this, or the level of risk might be higher than you think it is, right?
So for that policy, maybe up their premium because they're not sort of telling it like it is. Yeah.
Maybe up the premium just a hair, yeah, because they're spending too many pictures of beers on roofs.
It's like just layering all this stuff together for a particular use case, and that does happen. I mean, I've seen it happen, but yeah, it's continuing to happen, I suppose. But maybe what's changing the landscape is like how much, maybe some more clarity around what people are divulging, whether they're aware of that opt-in process and how that's actually being used about them. Because sometimes we are our own worst enemies with the amount of information we disclose unwillingly. So you're just saying that this does happen, like insurance company will go to Instagram, hey, give me some information on these users and see if there's any images that have been AI labeled as roof.
That's absolutely the future, and if it's not happening already, it'll happen in the next couple of years. I think if we're talking about stances on like what data is going to be used or people think is acceptable. My stance is like anything you put publicly about yourself is fair game for anyone to see. I think I don't know a lot of people who have a lot crazier versions, which is like any data that exists about you, private or public, like it's fair game. I don't know if I feel very much like on that end of it. But I do think that people will always want to be found, right? Companies will always want to be found, right? No one, by virtue of being a company. So I think it's less about like I think we'll constantly think about what data we're going to be sharing, but at the end of the day, people want to be found, and we need to come up with better ways to help companies and people get found.
What about some books that you've read recently? If you have time, I know you're a very busy founder, but is there a book that's really changed your mind recently for the better and your way of thinking?
Um, Change my mind for the better. Um, I'm not sure if it's for the better. I recently read The Power Broker. Um, and that's an interesting book about. It's a fascinating book about Robert Moses, who is it's called The Power Broker, Robert Moses in the Fall of New York. Um, And basically, it just outlines the power that he had shaping, basically what New York looked like. He built most of the bridges and tunnels in New York. He built almost all of the parks on Long Island and upstate New York. He was just like in power for like 50 years, in charge of like the parks department. But he like, I think people said that he had more power than anyone except for maybe like the governor of New York or like FDR, if you've heard of him. So it was a very interesting, he was an incredibly interesting person, very mixed legacy. I guess whenever I read things like that, I just think about, especially when it's a thing that's so foreign to me, which is government and policy. It's just sort of a little eye opening on the power that one person can have in shaping, a city like New York City.
That's great. It's very different to some of the other ones people mentioned. What about a favorite website resource that you'd recommend other people check out?
This is something I posted about recently. This is something for the, I don't know if you're a basketball fan, but if there's any NBA nerds, data nerds out there, there's a website called Cleaning the Glass, and it's an incredible website. It basically takes all the stats that you can get on the NBA website, but it also analyzes them in comparison to every other player. So you can see, not just how many points per game a player has or assists, but in clutch time, what does that look like, and how does that compare to every other player at their position? It just sort of shows you the game of basketball in a very nuanced way, and it even generates new stats that you haven't heard of. And I think that's the kind of paradigm. Honestly, I'm kind of thinking about building ExactBuyer in that model of how do you take something that people know so well, like the game of basketball, right, and just like blow it up completely into just like dissect it into 100 million. Just the guy who also who built it. He used to work for the Portland Trailblazers and the Philadelphia 76ers. And he's just like an incredible basketball mind in any case. So the fact that he's sort of bringing this explanation of basketball and data, sort of fusing them together, for me, it's a different way of exploring the game that I really like.
What about a piece of tech you can't do without that helps you do your job better? Could be hardware or software.
I think Slack probably. I think I'm on Slack more than most other things. I know it's kind of like a not a sexy answer. What is something that I use a lot more than I should? Probably Notes, which is terrible because I worked at OneNote. So yeah.
I love it. What about a quote or a meme or something funny about the data industry that makes you laugh every time?
I don't have a meme, but I do want to mention Oren Hoffman. Are you familiar with Oren Hoffman? So Oren Hoffman he's one of the smartest guys in the data space. I would say he's, to me, the person I probably read most about. And he has a company called SafeGraph. And he has another podcast of specifically, it's called World of DaaS, specifically about data as a service. So he's a great person to know. So I would say I'm not very funny, but you should check out Oren Hoffman.
And back to you now. I know you've been very subtly talking about what you do, but I've been following your progress for a while. I'm really impressed with what you're doing. Tell us a bit about what you're working on right now, and how can what's the value for people who may be interested.
So, we're building ExactBuyer, and it's basically kind of like we mentioned, we're just trying to make B2B data more accurate. And that starts with really, really boring things, like just making sure like we have the correct address for most companies around the world, right? It's actually a much harder problem than you would think because every country has a different way of, different format for their addresses. And if you don't know where people are located, yeah, there's like the Asian countries are completely different. Fractions are crazy. So we're trying to solve a lot of the sort of boring problems around just like understanding, just getting business data for global companies. But then we're also trying to analyze the text of the way that businesses describe themselves, and help users find those companies based on how they describe themselves. So the ultimate goal of what we're trying to say is we want to look at all of your public identities, all the ways in which you as a person or a company describe yourself, and then help other folks search for you specifically and make sure that they're building more accurate lists to be able to sell to.
I mean, it's a huge problem. I know I've done this personally, and I've had a lot of hits and misses with different providers over the years. And I think it does. If I can make one recommendation to anyone who's listening, I'm like, just pay for quality, and do your own tests, and that will like return you way more. Like, don't cheapen out and go, I want to get 10 cents instead of 15 cents per contact. Like, pay the highest amount, I would say, almost. Double check, but you get what you pay for.
The ROI on data is like, it's always like 100x, which is why it's kind of like stupid to put into a slide or a presentation. It's like, doesn't make any sense.
What if someone is really interested about what you're saying, what's getting into contact with you? What's the best method just to strike up an initial conversation?
Yeah, so you can reach out to me via email, edan@exactbuyer.com, or you can find me on LinkedIn. Pretty easy to get a hold of, so just hit me up there. If you want to see my really, really terrible NBA takes on Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter as well.
Hey, well, Edan, I just want to thank you for the time. I know you're a very busy founder, so enjoy the rest of your evening over there. I'm going to start my day. It's Friday morning here, so
It's just my name, Edan Krolewicz, @Edan Krolewicz. Yeah, thanks for having me, man. This is fun.